Welcome to the overview video for Chapter 3, Polyphony through the 13th century. Your learning objectives are: number 1, to describe the varieties of polyphony practiced between 1050 and 1300 and trace their historical development. Number 2, to define important terms and identify the people, works, and schools of composition that played a major role in the development of early polyphony. And 3, to describe the origins and early evolution of the motet. For Chapter 3, we are going to be listening to 3 works: NAWM 8-14, NAWM 8-17, and NAWM 8-19. So those are the 3 songs that we will be listening to from this chapter. Okay, you have 3 5-point listening quizzes on 8-14, 8-17, and 8-19. They'll ask you questions about how many vocal parts there are, what kind of organum it is, what interval is separating the 2 voices, what kind of intervals there are. They will ask you what kind of style shifts of organum there are, what kind of rhythms, what kind of text setting you hear, the style of the dupla melody, and the text performed in the 2 parts. They will also ask you about modal rhythms, paired imitation, the imitative effect heard, the style of organum, and how the different parts differ. So hopefully you'll be able to hear those things. Polyphony, music for 2 or more independent voices, heightened the grandeur of chant. Like medieval art, it was valued as decoration. Notation developed in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries allowed musicians to write down polyphony and create more elaborate varieties. The rise of written polyphony signals the beginning of Western music's distinctive precepts: counterpoint, harmony, the centrality of notation, and composition as distinct from performance. Polyphony began as a manner of performance, became a practice of oral composition, and developed into a written tradition. Polyphony was first described in the treatise Musica Inchiriadis, which used the term organum for the various styles of polyphony and for a piece that uses polyphony. In parallel organum, an added voice, the organal voice, appears below a chant melody, which is the principal voice, moving in parallel fifths. Either or both voices may be doubled at the octave. Here's an example from our book. Here's the example of mixed parallel and oblique organum. Here's the example of free organum. In mixed parallel and oblique organum, an organal voice either moves in parallel fourths below a principal voice or remains stationary in order to avoid sounding a tritone. The earliest sources of organum give examples of how to extemporize an organal voice below chant in performance. As the range of choices increased, some organa were written down as compositions. In free organum, the added voice usually sings above the chant, although the voices may cross, moving in contrary, oblique, parallel, and similar motion to the chant, and forming consonant intervals with it, unisons, fourths, fifths, or octaves. Instructions on how to compose or improvise organum of this type are preserved in the treatise Ad Organum Faciendum, which translates to On Making Organum, from 1100. Only the portions of chant that were sung by soloists were set polyphonically. In performance, sections of polyphony alternate with sections of monophonic chant sung by the choir. New types of polyphony, called Aquitanian polyphony, appeared early in the 12th century in the Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France. Most of the repertoire of Aquitanian polyphony comprises polyphonic settings of verses, a type of Latin poem. The two main styles of Aquitanian polyphony are discant, both voices move at about the same rate, and florid organum, the upper voice sings many notes for each note in the lower voice. In both styles, the lower voice is called the tenor and is decorated by the upper voice. Score notation was used in the early 12th century to show the alignment of the parts, but the durations were not indicated. Modern editors and performers vary in the solutions that they offer. An even more elaborate style of composed polyphony was developed in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in the late 12th and 13th century. Notre Dame composers developed the first rhythmic notation since ancient Greece. They used combination of note groups, known today as the 6 rhythmic modes. The basic unit of time was always grouped in threes. Leoninus from 1150 to 1201 and Perotinus, late 12th and early 13th centuries, composed a polyphony associated with Notre Dame. Leoninus compiled a Magnus Liber Organi, or a great book of polyphony, containing 2 voice settings of the solo portions of the responsorial chants for major feasts of the church year. Many composers added to and altered Magnus Liber Organi to decorate the chant further. A little taste of NAWM 17 from your book. Leoninus's organum for soloists is in 2 voices and alternates sections of organum style with sections in discant style. The sections for choir are plain chant and sung in unison. In organum style, like Aquitanian florid organum, the chant melody is in long notes in the tenor, while the upper voice sings melismas. The sections in discant style use the rhythmic modes in both voices and tend to appear where there are melismas in the original chant. Notre Dame organum may have been composed orally through the use of and improvisation on melodic formulas. A clausula is a self-contained section of an organum setting a word or syllable from the chant and closing with a cadence. Substitute clausulae were new sections designed to replace the original setting of a particular segment of a chant. Typically, they were in discant style. In the discant of Perotinus's generation, the tenor typically repeated a rhythmic motive based on a rhythmic mode. A two-voiced organum was called organum duplum. A three-voice organum was called a triplum, and a four-voice organum was called a quadruplum. Duplum, triplum, and quadruplum are also the names of the voices in ascending order above the tenor. All upper voices use rhythmic modes and move in similar ranges. Peritonitis' setting of Viderunt omnes in AWM 19 is an organum quadruplum that uses several of his typical traits. So that's a little taste of that. Starting in early 13th century, words were often added to the upper voices of a discant clausula. This produced a new genre, the motet, from the French word mot for word. The duplum of a motet is called the motetus. New types of motets developed, including ones with French texts, secular topics, three or more voices, or rhythms increasingly free of the rhythmic modes. Motets usually have different texts in each voice and therefore are identified by the first few words of each voice from highest to lowest. In the earliest motets, the texts in the upper voices often elaborate on the words and meaning of the chant text. Because motets were sung for secular as well as sacred occasions, the tenor, or chant, soon lost its exclusively liturgical function and became raw material for composition. Composers reworked existing motets in various ways, by writing a new Latin or French text for the duplum, by adding a third or fourth voice with separate texts, or by deleting the original duplum and writing new voices. After 1250, composers used tenor melodies from other chants and secular music. The tenor became a cantus firmus, an existing melody, usually a plain chant, on which a new polyphonic work was based. Later, motets were less dependent on rhythmic modes, and their increasing rhythmic variety and complexity called for a new notational system. This new system was called Franconian notation, after the theorist Franco of Cologne, and was described in his Ars Cantus Miserabilis around 1280. In this system, relative durations were signified by note shapes, the same principle underlying modern notation. Although this notation still emphasized threefold divisions, it gave new freedom from the rhythmic modes. Using Franconian notation, composers wrote motets in which the upper voices feature more rhythmic freedom and variety, and the same pattern rarely repeats from one measure to the next. The tempo is slower in order to accommodate for shorter durations, and voices rarely cadence together. The polyphonic conductus is a 2 to 4 voice setting of a rhymed rhythmic strophic Latin poem on a sacred or serious topic. The tenor is newly written, not based on chant. All voices sing the text together in a predominantly syllabic or homorhythmic texture. Some conductus feature long melismas called caudae or tails, especially at the beginning or end. Conductus with caudae are usually through composed, but those without tend to be strophic. So that is your overview for chapter 3. So looking at your quiz, you need to know what polyphony is, why it's significant. You need to know about parallel organum. You need to know about the different motion in organum. There's a nice table in your book. You need to know about Aquitanian organum, the different forms of organum. You need to know about Leoninus and Paratinus. You need to know about Notre Dame polyphony. You need to know about rhythmic modes. You need to know about motets. You need to know about Franconian motets. You need to know about conductus. Know the architectural style of Notre Dame Cathedral. And I think that will cover it. There's 25 questions as normal on your Chapter 3 quiz. I hope these videos are helpful and that they guide you and direct you on what we're wanting you to know and learn.